In the last 20 years, Lufthansa has quietly spent around $2 billion buying up its own competitors, not to improve them, not to expand their routes, in most cases to strip their independence, absorb their slots, and eliminate the competition entirely. Today, Lufthansa controls 5 major airlines across Europe, dominates nearly every significant hub in Central Europe, and operates what is effectively a monopoly on German domestic aviation. And the strangest part is, they built that monopoly by deliberately destroying the one thing airlines are supposed to protect above all else: their own brand. So how did a state-owned airline that nearly went bankrupt in 1992 engineer the most aggressive consolidation in European aviation history? How did regulators allow it to happen? And what did it actually cost the hundreds of millions of passengers now trapped inside Lufthansa's system? To understand how Lufthansa became what it is today, you have to go back to the moment it almost ceased to exist. In 1992, Lufthansa posted a massive loss of nearly 400 million Deutsche Marks. The airline was bloated, state-owned, and burning cash. Germany's flag carrier looked like it might not survive the decade. Then Jürgen Weber took over as CEO and launched one of the most radical turnarounds in airline history. He slashed costs, restructured the entire company from a single monolithic airline into a collection of independent business units covering passenger flights, cargo, maintenance, and catering, and he pushed relentlessly toward full privatization. By 1997, the German government had sold off almost its entire stake. Lufthansa was finally a private company. But that same year, something else happened that would reshape the airline's strategy for the next 3 decades. The European Union completed the final phase of airline deregulation. For the first time, any airline owned by EU nationals could fly freely on any domestic route within any member state. Overnight, Lufthansa's comfortable monopoly on German domestic routes was legally open to anyone willing to compete. And competitors arrived almost immediately. In February 1998, Deutsche BA entered Lufthansa's most profitable domestic routes. Lufthansa's response was swift and devastating. On every single route Deutsche BA announced, Lufthansa immediately matched or undercut fares and flooded the market with additional flights. When GoFly, a low-cost subsidiary of British Airways, launched cheap flights from London to Munich, Lufthansa did the same thing. Drop prices, increase frequency, absorb the losses. When Germania tried to break into the Berlin to Munich corridor, Lufthansa added so many flights at reduced fares that the German cartel office famously ruled in 2002 that Lufthansa's strategy against Germania constituted illegal predatory pricing. The pattern repeated with virtually every challenger that attempted to compete on German soil, and here's what made the strategy so effective. Lufthansa didn't need to win on those routes, it just needed to make sure nobody else could. As long as the losses on contested routes were smaller than the profits Lufthansa earned from the rest of its unchallenged network, the airline could afford to bleed competitors dry for months or even years. One by one, those challengers either retreated, downsized, or collapsed, and Lufthansa quietly reclaimed its dominance over German skies. But crushing competitors on price was only the first phase of the strategy, because Lufthansa realized something far more powerful than undercutting fares. Why destroy a competitor when you can simply buy them? In 2005, Lufthansa acquired Swiss International Airlines, giving it control of the Zurich hub. In 2009, it absorbed Austrian Airlines, locking down Vienna. By 2017, it held a majority stake in Brussels Airlines, adding yet another European capital to its portfolio. And then there was Eurowings. Unlike the carriers Lufthansa had tried to crush through fare wars, Eurowings had actually been a partner. Back in the late 90s, Eurowings was a small regional airline flying routes Lufthansa didn't want. The two carriers signed a code-share agreement, and by 2001, Lufthansa had bought a stake in the company, gradually increasing it until taking full control by 2011. The airline that once operated alongside Lufthansa was now Lufthansa, wearing a different uniform. And that acquisition revealed the real genius of the strategy. Because Lufthansa didn't just want market share, it wanted something regulators would have never allowed a single airline to hold. It wanted to operate across every price tier, at every major hub, under names that made it look like passengers still had a choice: Swiss for premium long-haul out of Zurich, Austrian for Eastern European connections through Vienna, Brussels Airlines for African routes via Belgium, Eurowings for budget travelers across the continent. 5 brands, 1 company. The illusion of competition in a market increasingly controlled by a single group. But all of this market engineering came at a price Lufthansa didn't fully anticipate. Because the strategy didn't just reshape the European airline market, it began to corrode Lufthansa's own flagship product. Throughout the 2000s, Lufthansa had been considered one of the finest airlines in the world. German engineering, punctuality, premium service. The brand meant something. But as the group expanded and the corporate strategy shifted from quality to control, the flagship began to suffer. Investment that could have gone into new cabins, better service, and modern aircraft was instead funneled into acquisitions and integration costs. Long-haul business class seats on Lufthansa fell behind competitors like Singapore Airlines, Qatar Airways, and even some of its own Star Alliance partners. Customer satisfaction scores declined year after year. The airline that once defined European premium travel was increasingly seen as overpriced and outdated, and Lufthansa didn't just accept that decline. In a sense, it engineered it, because the entire multi-brand strategy only works if the low-cost subsidiaries are cheap enough to capture budget travelers, and the mainline brand is just premium enough to charge higher fares without actually delivering a meaningfully better product. The gap between Lufthansa and Eurowings needed to exist, but it didn't need to be large. But the story doesn't end with a quietly declining brand and a growing portfolio of subsidiaries. Because in 2020, the entire system Lufthansa had spent decades building was stress-tested in the most brutal way imaginable. When the pandemic collapsed global air travel almost overnight, Lufthansa's sprawling empire went from a strategic advantage to an existential liability. 5 airlines, hundreds of aircraft, over 130,000 employees across dozens of countries, and almost zero revenue. Within weeks, Lufthansa was burning through cash so fast that bankruptcy became a genuine possibility. The irony was staggering. The company that had spent 30 years engineering a monopoly was now too large to save itself. So the German government stepped in with a €9 billion rescue package, one of the largest airline bailouts in history. In exchange, Berlin took a 20% ownership stake. The airline that Jürgen Weber had fought for a decade to privatize was effectively renationalized. A state-owned monopoly had become a private monopoly, had become a state-owned monopoly again. And the conditions attached to that bailout should have been the moment regulators finally clipped Lufthansa's wings. The European Commission demanded Lufthansa surrender valuable landing slots at Frankfurt and Munich, its 2 most important hubs, to allow competitors to enter. And Lufthansa agreed. But here's what actually happened. The slots were offered, but very few competitors could afford to build viable operations at those airports on such short notice. The barriers to entry that Lufthansa had spent decades constructing, the frequency dominance, the loyalty programs, the ground infrastructure, none of that went away just because a few landing slots changed hands. Within 2 years, Lufthansa had repaid enough of the bailout for the government to begin selling its stake. The slots that were surrendered largely failed to produce meaningful new competition. And Lufthansa emerged from the pandemic with its empire not just intact, but arguably stronger, because many of the independent airlines that might have competed for those slots hadn't survived the pandemic at all. And Lufthansa wasn't finished. Even after the bailout, even after the EU conditions, the acquisition machine kept running. In 2024, Lufthansa finalized a deal to take a 41% stake in ITA Airways, the successor to Italy's Alitalia. Rome, another European capital hub, another flag carrier absorbed into the Lufthansa system. The EU approved it with conditions, as it always does. Lufthansa agreed to surrender some slots at Milan Linate, as it always does. And the most likely outcome is the same one that has played out in Zurich, Vienna, Brussels, and across Germany. Short-term concessions that fade as the competitive landscape settles back into Lufthansa's favor. So here's where it all comes together. In 1992, Lufthansa was a failing state airline that couldn't fill its own planes. Today, it controls 5 major airlines, 6 primary European hubs, over 700 aircraft, and carries more than 120 million passengers every year on 37 billion euros in annual revenue. It accomplished this not by building the best airline, but by ensuring no one else could build a viable alternative. Every competitor was either undercut, acquired, or outlasted. Every regulatory concession was absorbed and neutralized. And the Lufthansa brand itself, the thing customers actually interact with, was allowed to quietly decline because the strategy was never about being the best airline. It was about being the only airline, and that might be the most uncomfortable truth in European aviation. Passengers across the continent believe they're choosing between Swiss and Austrian and Brussels Airlines and Eurowings and Lufthansa. 5 names, 5 logos, 5 different booking websites, but behind every one of them sits the same company, in the same boardroom, in Frankfurt. The illusion of choice in a market where real competition has been systematically dismantled for over 2 decades. The next time you book a flight across Europe, take a look at who actually operates it. You might be surprised how often the answer is the same. If you found this story fascinating, hit subscribe for more stories like this.